Big Shaq thought he was just helping a lost child, until the neighborhood turned against him. A viral video. A racist whisper. A storm of lies. But when the truth finally speaks, it's not just his name at stake, it's everything the world believes about heroes. One act of kindness becomes the trigger for a town's darkest instincts. This isn't just about race, it's about what we choose to see and what we ignore. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Maple Street woke up slow and soft, blanketed in the kind of morning that made coffee taste sweeter and lawns smell greener. The old sycamore stood tall and proud, shading the sidewalks like nature's own cathedral, the kind of place where dogs trotted leash-free beside joggers, kids rode their bikes without helmets, and neighbors waved without needing a reason. In this quiet slice of Georgia, nestled just outside the louder hum of Atlanta, Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal had become something more than a retired NBA legend. He was the guy who sponsored the high school basketball team's uniforms every year, the man who hosted free barbecues at the park on Sundays, the tall shadow who helped carry groceries for widows, without ever letting it feel like charity. To the people of Brookridge, he wasn't just a millionaire, he was a neighbor with a heart that outgrew his towering frame. Big Shaq's home stood at the curve of Maple Street, where the cul-de-sac rounded into a small clearing that locals called the Hollow. His house wasn't showy. Sure, it was large. It had to be, to hold his custom-built piano and those massive shoes that didn't fit any shelf. But it wore humility in every brick. American flags lined the front porch. His mother's favorite wind chimes played a soft tune whenever the breeze passed by. Every kid on the block had once been invited over to shoot hoops in his driveway or share an ice pop on a hot day. But even the kindest giants cast shadows, especially in places where prejudice lingered like humidity, invisible, clinging, and ever-present. That Monday morning, storm clouds had started rolling in by noon. The forecast promised thunder but not trouble. It was the kind of storm Georgia knew well. A crack of lightning, a sky that darkened quickly, and a few soaked shoes left outside by mistake. Shaq had just come back from the local grocery store, balancing 3 paper bags in one arm and using the other to pull his gate closed. That's when he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 10. Blonde hair plastered to her forehead, sneakers caked in mud, and a pale yellow dress that looked like it had seen better weeks. She stood at the edge of his driveway, unsure if she should come closer. Her hands gripped the straps of her tiny backpack so tightly they trembled. Shaq didn't speak right away. He'd learned over the years that his size, his very presence, could scare people if he moved too fast. So he crouched slowly, setting the bags down with the same care he used when placing glass trophies in display cases. Then he offered her the softest smile a man of his size could manage. "Hey there, little one," he said gently. "You okay? Storm's coming in." She nodded, barely. No words.
"You lost."
She hesitated. Then a tiny shake of her head. No. But she didn't move. Didn't speak. "Wanna come inside? Just till the rain passes. Got juice. Cartoons. Nobody's gonna bother you here." Still no words, but her feet shifted toward him like instinct answered. When logic froze, he opened the gate slowly, letting her walk through before it clanged shut behind her. Inside, she stayed quiet. He gave her a towel and let her pick a spot on the couch. She sat curled up like a cat who'd spent too long outside, cautious, alert, not quite ready to trust but grateful for the roof and the warmth. As the storm outside began to thrum against the windows, she sipped apple juice and stared at the television, though it was clear her mind was somewhere else. Shaq didn't pry. He just let her be. He'd seen that look before, in shelters, in waiting rooms, in his own mirror when his father died. Some silences didn't need breaking. From the window, Mrs. Carmichael, the neighbor across the street, watched with binoculars. She didn't bother to hide. Her lace curtains fluttered like whispers. Behind her, a pie burned in the oven. Unnoticed, her eyes were locked on Shaq's porch, on the little girl stepping through the door. To Mrs. Carmichael, and soon to Darlene Whitmore, who lived 4 houses down and had a mouth that moved faster than her mind. The scene didn't look like kindness. It looked like a headline. A black man, a white girl, alone. She didn't stop to wonder if the child had not. Didn't think about how Shaq had lived on this street for 10 years without incident. She didn't remember the Christmases he delivered gifts door to door, dressed as Santa, or the scholarships he funded in secret. She only saw a possibility, one that matched the quiet biases tucked into the corners of her conscience, like old receipts, uncomfortable, outdated, but never thrown away. The storm passed quickly. The girl never gave a name, just asked softly if he could call someone for her, a number scribbled on a rain-smudged note. He dialed, handed her the phone, and stepped outside to give her privacy. That phone call, short and trembling, led to more misunderstandings, because on the other end was a frantic relative who'd been looking for her, and when they heard a deep voice in the background, then learned she was in the home of a man twice her size, they panicked. Shaq didn't know that as he handed her a fresh pair of socks and packed snacks for her trip home, Darlene was already calling the police, or that her version of the story would soon circle through group chats, Facebook posts, and whispered conversations at the town diner. The girl had been taken. The man who did it. That O'Neill fella. The giant who never quite belonged, no matter how many smiles he wore. By evening, the streets of Brookridge no longer felt like home. Patrol cars slowed as they passed his house. A news van parked near the hollow, camera lens pointed like a barrel. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains that used to open for waves and lemonade offers. Shaq sat on the porch, watching the sky clear. The girl was gone, safely returned. But something had shifted, not in the sky, in the air between him and the world. As if trust itself had caught a fever. As if kindness now required a witness. He didn't curse, didn't complain. Just leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, wind chimes playing a sad, slow tune. The echoes of Maple Street had started to shift, and the storm, it seemed, had only just begun. The sun returned the next morning, as if it had something to prove. Bright, unapologetic, drying puddles from the storm, like it wanted to erase any trace of the night before. But not everything could be dried up or swept away. Not the talk, not the glances, not the whisper that started with Darlene Whitmore. She sat on her porch with her morning tea, hands folded tightly in her lap, like she was praying without moving her lips. Her eyes didn't stray from Shaquille O'Neal's house. Across the street, his lawn was freshly mowed, and the porch chairs were back in place. Shaq himself had just walked a box of canned goods to the nearby community pantry. It was a peaceful scene, if you wanted to see it that way. But Darlene had never been one to see the world without filters. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She picked it up and sent a message to her cousin Lacey in 2 short sentences. Girl, something ain't right across the street. He had that little white girl in his house all night. There was no malice in her voice when she typed it, at least not in the way she would admit. To her it was concern. It was community awareness. It was just being cautious. But deep in the folds of her memory sat stories fed to her by generations. Ones that turned worry into suspicion whenever color entered the equation. By midday the whisper had legs, and they ran fast. Mrs. Carmichael dropped it into her church prayer group's text thread. 2 houses down, twins Lisa and Linda told their barber during their lunch cut. The mailman, pausing to sip a soda under the shade, overheard 2 versions of the story within the same hour. One where Shaq had locked the girl inside, and another where someone had seen her crying in the window. None of it had been verified. No one had asked Shaq. No one had spoken to the girl's family. But the story had just enough empty space to let fear fill it. That night, the local Facebook group Brookridge Buzz lit up. Does anyone know why the police were at Big Shaq's house? He was with a little girl yesterday. I don't want to say too much, but it looked sus. Kinda always knew he wasn't as wholesome as he acted. Just a vibe. Darlene watched from her phone, each comment feeding her a validation she hadn't known she was hungry for. She hadn't made it up, she told herself. She'd seen it with her own eyes. And wasn't that enough? A day later, the whisper became a story. A local blogger, desperate for traction, published an article titled Fallen Giant. It didn't name Shaq directly, but it didn't have to. It mentioned a former celebrity, a community figure, under informal investigation, after being seen with an unidentified minor. It cited concerned neighbors and unconfirmed sources. The kind of piece that didn't need facts, just the smoke of implication. It was enough. Harper Quinn, a young freelance journalist working in Atlanta, saw the blog late that night while researching community reactions to post-celebrity figures. She was about to close the tab when a line caught her eye. Former NBA athlete turned suburban icon. Her curiosity wasn't about the scandal, but about the vagueness. Something didn't sit right. She bookmarked the article, planning to look deeper. Back on Maple Street, the tension grew thick. Shaq, ever intuitive, noticed the difference. The way the mailman barely made eye contact. The way kids who used to wave now looked at their parents first. He heard the silence louder than any accusation. He'd walked this line before. The line between what people said and what they believed when the doors were closed. Lucille, his mother, called that evening. She hadn't heard the rumors. Not yet. But she heard something in his voice that she hadn't in years. "Don't shrink," she told him. "Not for them. Not again." He smiled. The way sons do, when mothers say something they need to hear. But he didn't tell her everything. Meanwhile, Darlene received a message from a tabloid editor she'd once worked with as a temp. She had sent the tip anonymously, but her name had somehow been connected. They offered to fact-check her experience. Maybe even quote her anonymously. Payment optional, depending on exclusivity. She agreed before thinking twice. What began as a whisper had become a wildfire. And Darlene, who once just wanted to be seen, now found herself watched. At a local diner the next day, she told the story like it was a civic duty. "I don't like making assumptions," she said, leaning forward over her coffee. "But you gotta trust your gut. You don't just see a grown man with a white child who don't belong to him and not ask questions." Someone asked if the girl looked scared. She wasn't talking, looked shell-shocked, wouldn't even look up. "Tell me that ain't weird?" Someone else asked if she called the police. "Course I did. What kind of person wouldn't?" But she didn't say that by the time she called. The girl had already left safely. She didn't say the police didn't follow up. And she definitely didn't say that nothing had actually happened. What mattered now wasn't truth. It was perception. And perception had teeth. At the neighborhood HOA meeting later that week, Shaq showed up in his usual calm. He brought lemonade and offered to restock the park's sports equipment fund. The room got quiet. Conversations slowed when he passed. Even those who still believed in him didn't know how to act. Because once doubt entered a room, it didn't need a chair. It just stood in the corner watching. Harper Quinn, watching from a distance, decided to drive to Brookridge. She didn't have a pitch yet, but she had a gut feeling. The story being told didn't match the man's reputation. And in journalism, sometimes that was where the real truth waited, beneath the noise. She watched from her car, as Shaq helped an elderly man load gardening supplies into his trunk. She watched him carry a sleeping toddler from the grass to her mother's arms. Nothing about him screamed scandal. Everything about him said seen it all. She opened her notebook and wrote one line. What happens when the community's hero becomes its shadow? Back in her house, Darlene closed her blinds early. The attention was starting to turn. Some neighbors had begun asking questions about her version of events. A few noticed that her posts were always the first to stir panic in the Facebook group. And while no one said it outright, a new whisper had begun. Not about Shaq, but about her. Because fire spreads both ways. And the same gossip that burns a name down can just as easily circle back. Maple Street once again seemed peaceful. But this time it was the kind of quiet that came before a different kind of storm. Shaquille O'Neal had always known that fame had two faces. One smiled with you in grocery store selfies and autographed fan mail. The other waited patiently for the moment your halo slipped, ready to turn admiration into ammunition. He had lived long enough in the spotlight to understand how fast love turned to suspicion, especially when you were a black man in America. But nothing prepared him for the sting of betrayal when the video surfaced. It wasn't filmed maliciously, not at first. Just a passerby, phone in hand, pausing at the corner of Maple Street, as rain threatened from above. The video showed Shaq, his unmistakable frame, hunched to avoid scaring the child beside him, walking the lost girl toward his front gate. Her hand was in his, small and pale against the dark backdrop of his own. There was no context, no backstory, no follow-up clip of her sipping juice or calling her family. Just 23 seconds of silent footage, posted with the caption, "What's this about?"
Dad.
Brookridge. It took 6 hours to go viral. The algorithms did their work. Comments exploded. Some recognized him immediately. The giant, the legend, the man who built schools and hospitals and still called his mother every Sunday. Others didn't care who he was. Looks sketchy AF. Why is he holding her hand like that? Did anyone call CPS? Fame doesn't mean innocent. By the next morning, 3 local stations had picked it up. One anchor danced around words like inappropriate contact and unverified behavior. Another called it a developing concern, and the worst of them, a tabloid-style evening segment, titled The Story from Hero to Headline, What's Happening on Maple Street, Shaq watched it all unfold in silence from his den. The volume turned low enough that Lucille wouldn't hear it if she called. The footage looped over and over, her hand in his, her silent eyes, his steady steps. He didn't recognize himself in the coverage. They didn't show the towels he offered, the apple juice, or the way he'd waited in the kitchen while she made the call. They didn't ask what kind of man would give his own dinner to a stranger's child without question. All they needed was the image, the implication. A man once cheered for in stadiums now sat alone in his living room, painted as a shadow lurking behind good intentions. Outside, media trucks lined the street. Neighbors began double parking to avoid walking past his house. Children were told not to ring his doorbell. The basketball hoop he'd installed for community games sat unused. The ball, left on the driveway, collected dust instead of laughter. Lucille called that night. Her voice, though always warm, carried an edge that only came out when her son was hurting. "I saw it," she said gently. "Baby, don't let their blindness dull your shine." "I'm fine, Ma," he lied. "No, you're not," she replied. "But you will be." He didn't want to tell her that what stung most wasn't the video. It wasn't even the headlines. It was the silence from people who once called him family. The barber who used to cut his hair for free hadn't returned his calls. The high school coach he donated lockers to had posted a cryptic tweet about people not being who they seem. And his mailbox was now stuffed with flyers, but not a single thank you note from the same families he'd helped pay rent for last winter. He wasn't just being accused, he was being erased. The weight of it all pressed against his chest in quiet moments. He sat at the piano, some nights, hands hovering over the keys, but the music wouldn't come. He tried to write, tried to cook, even tried praying longer than usual. But peace, once a regular visitor, now felt like a ghost. Memories began to surface, ones he had buried beneath years of goodwill and hope. He remembered being 17, pulled over after prom for fitting a description. He remembered the grip of cold cuffs despite his clean record. The officer had apologized later, but not before calling him boy 3 times and slamming him against a hood. His mother had fought like fire that night, marching into the precinct with nothing but truth in her voice and rage in her bones. "You will not stain my son with your fear," she'd told them. And now, decades later, the stain had come back. Not from police this time, but from a public that decided guilt was just a story well told. Across town, Harper Quinn watched from the sidelines. Her initial interest had grown into something deeper, a journalist's instinct mixed with a woman's outrage. She'd started reviewing the original video frame by frame. Something didn't sit right. The child hadn't looked scared. She looked tired. Her shoulders weren't tense, just drooped, and Shaq's hand wasn't gripping hers. It was supporting her. A detail lost on those who wanted scandal more than truth. Harper reached out to a few of the girl's relatives. None answered. The local police released a single vague statement. No charges filed. Matter resolved. But that wasn't enough. Not for the court of public opinion. They needed a villain, and Big Shaq's size made it easy to cast him as one. Harper started tracing the video's origin, eventually finding the first poster, a young man named Chad, who had only meant to share a weird moment. "I didn't think it'd blow up," he told her during a phone call. "He looked familiar. I thought it was cool. Then it got twisted." "Did you ever delete it?" "Nah. People just kept sharing. Then someone cropped it and added music. Then someone else added captions." The version going viral now had ominous background music, slow motion edits, and a red circle drawn around Shaq's hand. It wasn't a recording anymore. It was propaganda. Meanwhile, inside the house that once held laughter and music, Shaq paced. He didn't want to defend himself. It felt beneath him. But he also couldn't let this become the final word on his legacy. Lucille urged him to speak up. "They won't listen," he said quietly. "They listened when you said nothing," she replied. "Look what they heard." He nodded, but didn't move. Not yet. What haunted him most were the eyes of the girl, Savannah. In that brief moment, when she'd looked up at him from the couch, there had been trust, a pure, raw kind of belief that didn't come easy. He'd promised her safety, and he'd delivered, but now the world was using her moment of peace as proof of his guilt. It was betrayal not of her, but of the truth. In the coming days, Harper began compiling her own report. She tracked timelines, questioned neighbors, even interviewed local volunteers who confirmed Shaq's long history of community support. She didn't frame him as a saint, just as a man, a flawed, generous, quiet man, who had made a decision that too many others would have ignored. But even as she wrote, Harper knew the hardest part wouldn't be telling the truth. It would be getting people to hear it. Because when the headlines are loud, the truth has to scream, just to whisper. Savannah Lee sat in a small counseling room at the Department of Family Services, her legs tucked beneath her like she was trying to disappear into the cushion. The walls were soft blue, with cartoon animal decals peeling at the edges. A paper cup of water rested untouched in her hands. Across from her, a caseworker named Amanda waited patiently, hands folded, voice gentle. "Do you feel safe now, Savannah?" No answer. "Did the man hurt you?" Still nothing. Savannah's eyes remained fixed on the floor, watching a small tear in the carpet, as if it held the answers no one else seemed to. Amanda had been in this line of work long enough to know trauma when she saw it. But silence? Silence was tricky. It could mean fear. It could mean shame. Or, as Amanda had learned in some rare but unforgettable cases, it could mean loyalty, a guarded truth. But the rest of the world wasn't patient like Amanda. They weren't trained to wait for clarity. They saw silence and drew their own conclusions. Outside the DFS office, media still churned. News segments rehashed the story under new titles every few hours. Child silence raises questions. Former athlete under fire. Mystery grows in Maple Street incident. None of them had facts, just echoes. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his home that afternoon, quiet, unmoving. Lucille had flown in the night before and insisted on staying close. She cooked in silence, a rhythm of pots and spoons that filled the kitchen with sounds more comforting than words. He hadn't spoken publicly since the footage surfaced. He'd released no statement, given no interview, and refused to point fingers or correct anyone. His silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint, the kind his mother had taught him long ago. When folks start looking at you sideways, don't flinch. They want to see you break. Stay still, and let truth catch up. Still, it gnawed at him. Not the rumors, but the weight Savannah now carried. A child, used like a symbol, a pawn, a vessel into which adults poured their worst assumptions. He thought about her eyes. Wide, watery, but not scared. She hadn't flinched when he offered her juice. She hadn't pulled away when he handed her a towel. He knew the look of fear. He'd seen it in shelters, in hospital waiting rooms. Savannah had worn something different. Not fear but fatigue. A silence born not from terror but from too many adults asking questions. She didn't know how to answer. And now that silence had become its own crime. Social media platforms filled with speculation. One user dug up photos of Shaq from years ago. Events where he hugged children, handed out backpacks, laughed in the middle of crowds. They posted them with captions like "anyone else seeing a pattern here?" Every interaction reinterpreted. Every smile re-examined. The same actions once praised, now fed into suspicion. Shaq didn't scroll. He had Lucille filter the worst of it. Still, some things slipped through. At the grocery store, a woman stared too long in the cereal aisle. A man passed without acknowledging him, though they'd coached Little League together. Even the post office clerk, usually all grins and handshakes, looked down as he handed over the mail. He thought of Savannah again, in some unfamiliar room, being asked to explain what had no easy words. The guilt wasn't his, and yet it sat heavy in his chest. He couldn't defend himself without dragging her into a spotlight she didn't ask for, so he said nothing. Let the headlines build. Let the public wonder. Harper Quinn watched the media frenzy unfold with growing dismay. She had tried to contact Shaq, but his publicist declined interviews. She requested an official comment from DFS but received only a formal statement that the case was under review. Savannah's family had gone silent too, reportedly staying out of town for emotional recovery. In the absence of truth, noise filled the space. Back at DFS, Amanda tried a new approach. She laid out a tray of crayons and paper, sliding them towards Savannah with a quiet encouragement. "Draw whatever you want. Anything. No one's gonna judge it." Savannah hesitated, then picked up a crayon. She began with soft strokes. Blue sky, gray clouds, a figure standing under a porch, then another, taller figure. A dog, an umbrella. Her hand moved faster as the image took shape. Amanda watched silently. The drawing told a story no statement. That evening, Lucille sat on the porch, the chimes above her swaying in the breeze. Shaq joined her, a mug of chamomile in his hand. She didn't speak until he did. "You think silence is enough?" he asked. Lucille stared straight ahead. Depends on who's listening. I could say something, he continued. Set the record straight. You could, but then you invite more questions. More twisting. She's a kid, ma. She didn't ask for this. And neither did you. But we've both seen what happens when you give people your truth, and they turn it into their story. He nodded slowly, watching the horizon bleed into dusk. In the distance, a news van pulled away from the curb. That night, Harper published a new article. What Savannah drew. She didn't include names, didn't make claims, just described the drawing. A man holding an umbrella over a girl, while a storm raged around them. A porch. A warm window. A bowl of fruit on the table inside. Peace. The article was quiet, almost poetic. It didn't accuse or clear anyone. It just offered something the public had forgotten how to see. Nuance. A few readers noticed. Others dismissed it. But for the first time in days, a narrative shifted. Not completely, but enough for a crack of light to push through. Back in her temporary foster home, Savannah asked for the drawing to be returned. She wanted to keep it. At her side, Amanda smiled softly. Do you want to talk about what happened that day? Savannah shook her head, but for the first time she met Amanda's eyes. No, she said quietly. Not yet. And that was enough. For now, the quiet on Maple Street had changed its tone. It wasn't the stillness of calm anymore. It was the kind that settled after an unspoken accusation. The air between neighbors thick with things no one wanted to say out loud. Shaq noticed it most in the way people moved. Eyes that glanced and darted away. Footsteps that slowed near his house but never stopped. For the town, this moment felt new. For Shaq, it was déjà vu. One afternoon, as Lucille refolded the same dish towel for the third time, she glanced over her shoulder and said softly, "This ain't the first time they tried to write you out of your own story." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of what she meant had already pressed itself into the corners of his memory. Back then, the story started on a different street. The cracked sidewalks of Marietta, where he'd gone to college before the NBA lights ever touched his name. He was just Shaquille back then. No big Shaq, no community hero, just a scholarship kid with a size 22 shoe and dreams as big as his frame. He remembered the night vividly. The one that changed everything. It was spring. He had just left a study group late, after a tutoring session. He walked alone, headphones in, wearing the same school hoodie everyone else wore. The streets were empty, the air warm with the promise of summer. Then came the sirens. He didn't hear them at first, but he felt the beam of the spotlight cut through the darkness. He turned, confused, raised his hands instinctively. An officer barked at him to freeze. Another stepped out of the cruiser, gun drawn, pointed directly at his chest. They cuffed him before asking his name. There had been a gas station robbery an hour before. The suspect, black male, 6 feet, hoodie, walking north. That was all it took. He tried to explain. They didn't listen. He had ID in his pocket, but they wouldn't reach for it. They slammed him against the car hood, twisted his arm, called him boy, called him slick, told him to shut up and let the system sort it. The next morning he was released. No charges, just a generic apology. And the officer who signed the incident report. Deputy Blake Whitmore. Darlene's older brother. He hadn't forgotten the name. Not after what followed. Blake didn't apologize. In fact, he doubled down, telling reporters that Shaq was uncooperative and matched the description to a T. When pressed about the wrongful arrest, Blake shifted blame. It's better we be safe than sorry. Lucille had filed a formal complaint, but it disappeared somewhere in the system. The department called it a training error. Blake was quietly promoted 2 years later. The memory lingered like a scar, not because of the cuffs, but because of what they represented. The ease with which authority turned a black boy into a suspect. The way Blake looked him in the eye and saw danger, not humanity. Years passed. Shaq went pro. Fame softened the edges of judgment for most people. But he never forgot, and he never ran into Blake again, until 15 years later, at a fundraiser in Brookridge, where Darlene introduced herself with a syrupy smile. "You probably don't remember me," she'd said. "I'm Blake's sister." Small world, huh? He remembered. But he'd smiled back anyway, because Lucille had taught him that some fights weren't worth having. Not in public, not when the crowd was already choosing sides. Now, as the rumors around Savannah swirled and Darlene's voice once again carried weight it hadn't earned, the connection clicked into place. This wasn't just fear. It was history. Shaq didn't want revenge. That wasn't his way. But he needed to understand what game he was playing, and who had been keeping score all along. Harper Quinn, meanwhile, was doing her own digging. The more she researched Darlene Whitmore, the more inconsistencies emerged. Neighborhood blogs praised her involvement in community watch programs, but every incident she reported had the same pattern: vague, suspicious behavior. Always people of color. Never followed up. Never verified. Harper requested old police records, under a pseudonym. What she found deepened the cracks. Back in 1995, a formal complaint had been filed against Deputy Blake Whitmore by a college student, name redacted, but heightened school details unmistakably pointed to Shaq. The complaint cited racial profiling, verbal abuse, and unnecessary force. The case had been closed with no disciplinary action, but Harper had the document now. She stared at the screen, unsettled. This wasn't about one girl. This was about a story written long before Savannah ever wandered into Shaq's driveway. A story written in prejudice, passed down like a family heirloom. She printed the files, packed her notes, and returned to Brookridge. She wasn't ready to publish, not yet, but she needed to hear from Shaq directly. She needed his side, his voice, even if he chose not to use it. When she arrived, Lucille answered the door. "You here to dig deeper?" Lucille said, not unkindly. "I'm here to tell the whole story," Harper replied. They let her in. Shaq sat across from Harper in his den, a quiet strength radiating from him even in stillness. He didn't fidget, didn't avoid eye contact, but he didn't offer much either. Harper laid out the files. The old arrest, the complaint, Darlene's patterns. "I don't want to publish without your truth," she said. He exhaled slowly, then said, "That truth never saved me before. But it could save you now," she replied. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Let me ask you something," he said finally. "You think if I tell the world what Blake did to me, they'll care? Or you think they'll just say I'm playing the race card?" Harper didn't answer right away.
I think the world needs to hear it.
"Even if they don't believe it, they'll have to sit with it. And maybe that's enough." He nodded once. Still silent. Lucille stepped into the room then, her presence grounding them both. "You don't owe them pain," she told her son. "But if speaking it out loud keeps another boy from ending up in cuffs over nothing, maybe it's worth the breath." Shaq stood, walked to the piano, pressed a single key, then another. The sound filled the room, low, warm, steady. "I'll think about it," he said. And Harper, for the first time since she arrived, believed that he would. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the trees gently, like hands trying to stir something that had slept too long. The ghosts of the past had never left. But for the first time, someone had opened the window and let the light in. Maple Street's quiet facade had fractured. The atmosphere around Shaquille O'Neal's home shifted, drawing lines between those who believed in his innocence and those consumed by uncertainty. Morning clouds carried an edge, as if the weather itself awaited the next move. Neighborhood life had slowed to a whisper, but people still talked loud enough to be heard behind closed doors and from front porches. It started innocuously. A red pickup truck parked in front of Shaq's driveway for hours. Yellow police tape lingered longer than expected. Traffic slowed as drivers craned to catch glimpses of media vans parked down the block. Some residents paused while walking their dogs, exchanged conspiratorial looks, and edged their chairs forward during Zoom HOA meetings. When his name came up, inside the house, Shaq and Lucille listened to the stories. Their home, usually a refuge against the world, was now the eye of a tornado. Lucille never belittled his pain. She saw it in the deep crease beside his mouth and the way he stared at empty rooms. Still, she offered no public defense. His mother's silence was never silence. It was restraint. Meanwhile, down the street, two camps formed. At the top of Maple Street, Andrea Morales, who once accepted Shaq's charity with gratitude, now refused to return his wave. She whispered to other moms at pickup, wondering aloud if a hero could ever cross the line. Her husband, Tom, lit by a lifelong trust in law and order, told his children to stay away from Shaq's yard. "Until this ends," he said. At the bottom of the street, others rallied. A banner reading, "We choose truth, not fear," hung on the mail kiosk near the cul-de-sac. Principal Parker, a high school teacher credited to Shaq for new books for his class, led neighborhood vigils, lighting candles in silent support every evening. Volunteers cooked meals and delivered them to the porch with notes. "Thank you for believing in Brookridge." The gap widened with every unspoken glance. One afternoon, a group of protesters showed up. Not menacing, but persistent. They held signs that read "Truth for Savannah" and "What happened on Maple." The media rushed in again. Cameras blinked. Reporters asked questions, but the answers came back in well-worn phrases. "We're investigating." No comment. Shadow-filled interviews with residents reflecting fear and confusion. Shaq watched from the back window. Lucille guided his shoulders when his breath hitched. He didn't leave the house. He couldn't not without triggering another spectacle. Instead, he paced the halls, testing door handles as if afraid someone would bar his own home from him. Enter Harper Quinn. She parked her unmarked car 3 houses away and walked slowly toward the gathering. She wore no press badge, no microphone, just a voice recorder in her pocket and a notebook in her purse. Her instincts hummed in her ears like a heartbeat, steady and insistent. She approached Andrea Morales first, who clutched her protest sign with trembling fingers. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Harper asked quietly. Andrea dipped her chin, then reported her belief that the video just looked wrong. She feared for the community's children. She felt betrayed. "Have you ever known Shaq to act differently?" Harper pressed gently. Andrea hesitated. "Not before," she said softly. "But I don't know him now." Harper noted her unease. Everyone felt it, even if they wouldn't say it aloud. Nearby, Principal Parker held court with a few neighbors. Harper moved closer, studied their expressions, steadfast, resolute, tired. "We're not going to let fear win," he said. "We're going to let truth breathe." Harper sat on the curb, pulled out her notebook, and started scribbling. She looked from face to face, piecing together how the community was fracturing. She needed more. Inside Shaq's home, Lucille sat with a group of neighbors who supported him. They brought casseroles, not cameras. They spoke of deeds, free clinics, therapy scholarships, donated shoes. Some were old enough to remember Secretary Parker as Parker's student, someone who stood today for the man who'd stood for them. The voices were warm, but even they had a tremor. The tilt away from trust was steep. That evening, Harper sent a message to Shaq's publicist. Silent. She waited. A reply came late, offering a chance to meet the next day. It wasn't an interview request. It was permission to come in and talk. The next morning, Shaq opened the door to find her standing in the foyer. "I want to understand," she said simply. He nodded and led her into the den. Lucille lingered nearby but stayed quiet. There was no press crew, no cameras. Harper poured lemonade and sat, studying the home that had given him comfort and turned into a cage. She leafed through her notes. 2 sides, many doubts. One man in the center. "I've talked to people who support you," she began, "and some who don't. But my reporting needs more than emotion. It needs context." He watched her. Then he reached for his phone and played her the original voicemail he had from Savannah's aunt. "A child left alone in a storm, found safe and smiling. No panic. Just relief." Harper leaned forward, considering. "You're offering me one voice," she said. "But the crowd is loud." He nodded. "So find the others." Harper nodded back. She asked, "About Darlene's influence?" "She's a neighbor," he said. "She's also the sister of the man who had me arrested in college." His tone was factual, not bitter. History doesn't erase itself overnight. Harper gazed into his eyes. "Some of your neighbors called it unverified. They're not ready to listen." "I understand," he replied, "but I'll let truth stand if they'll let it." Harper left that day with more than notes in her book. She had a quiet purpose. She began tracing the origins of what she called the rumor factory. She traced press emails to Darlene. She found group texts, screenshots of conversations with local bloggers who amplified the story. She watched her interview recordings. Andrea, Principal Parker, volunteers, people whose trust had shaken but not shattered. She started writing. Meanwhile, the protest continued. Candles still glowed by night. Social media exploded. Harper's digging deeper. Big Shaq's truth remains untold. Some commenters threatened to file lawsuits if the charges didn't stick. Others thanked Harper for asking real questions. Inside the house that night, Shaq and Lucille sat together outside with 2 mugs of tea. The protest chants faded in the distance like a broken record stuck on repeat. "I met her," Shaq said. "She's asking." Lucille squeezed his hand. "Then she'll hear." He stared into his mug. Peace crackled between them like a live wire. Not easy, not comfortable, but necessary. On Maple Street, the divide deepened. Supporters planted bulbs on Shaq's lawn. Protesters moved their signs closer. And in local social groups, posts switched from "Did you see the video?" to "Will Harper tell us the whole story?" Harper's article published the next morning. Not what it looks like inside the man behind the headlines. It was long, detailed, sourced, careful. She laid out the voicemail transcript. She quoted neighbors who continued to support Shaq despite fear. She included his college arrest story, the raw document filing, front page to police blotter. She gave readers context, letting them decide. Then she released it. Silence followed. Paper rustled in driveways. Coffee mugs sat poised in conversation. The article wasn't a verdict. It was a mirror. A few days later, support letters began arriving for Shaq. Donations sent to Savannah's recovery fund. Apologies made publicly and privately. Some protesters left their signs on the curb, folded. Some neighbors mouthed, "Thank you," as she walked past. Not everyone shifted. A few blogs questioned Harper's impartiality, called her biased. But the momentum began to tilt. And the most powerful turn of all? Maple Street began to speak again. Not with fear, but with questions. The air was unusually still that morning. Maple Street, swollen with unspoken accusations and low-burning suspicion, seemed to hold its breath. The candles on Shaq's porch had melted into soft puddles of wax. Protest signs flapped quietly in the breeze. News vans idled, their engines soft but ever watching. Inside a low-lit counseling center miles from Brookridge, Savannah Lee finally spoke. She sat on a plush beanbag chair shaped like a giant turtle. The therapist, a woman named Melora, had stopped asking questions days ago. Instead, she created space, with crayons, warm tea, books about feelings. She let Savannah build a fort from pillows and hide until she didn't feel like hiding anymore. That morning, something cracked open. It started with 4 words. "I didn't run away," Savannah whispered. Melora, trained not to react too quickly, nodded and kept her voice soft. "You didn't?" Savannah shook her head slowly. Uncle Wade, he tried to hit me again." The room didn't move. Neither did Melora. She stayed grounded in the silence that followed, giving Savannah full ownership of the air between them. "My mom said she had to leave. Said she'd come back. But she didn't. I waited for her behind the store. It got cold. I didn't know what to do." She paused, eyes distant but focused. "Then I saw him. Big guy. Kinda looked like one of those old superheroes. I followed him without even thinking. He looked." "You followed him?" Savannah nodded. "I thought if he saw me, maybe he'd help. Maybe he'd stop walking and not yell. And he did." Melora felt the weight of every word. Every assumption now began to unravel. "I wasn't scared of him," Savannah said, firmer this time. "He gave me juice. And socks. He didn't even sit close to me. He just stayed nearby and asked if I wanted cartoons." The narrative, the twisted version painted by Darlene and the media, collapsed with every sentence. Later that day, Melora shared the session summary with the child protection liaison. After protocol review, it was cleared for the family's lawyer and passed along confidentially to Harper Quinn. When Harper read the transcript, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. Her instincts had been right. This wasn't just a case of racial bias or social hysteria. It was something deeper, a trauma misread, a protector villainized, and a child lost in the noise of grown-ups guessing. She opened her notes, reviewing every thread. The voicemail, the drawing, Shaq's steady silence. It all made sense now. Savannah hadn't been afraid of him. She had chosen him. Across town, Lena Lee, Savannah's mother, surfaced. She had been hiding, living with a cousin in Baton Rouge, trying to escape the man she once trusted. When she heard about the media storm, the accusations, the man her daughter had turned to being demonized, she returned to Georgia immediately. Harper intercepted her at the center. Lena's face was raw with regret, lined with stress. She looked younger than expected, but worn from something deeper than age. "I didn't think it'd turn into this," she said. "I just wanted to keep my baby safe. I didn't think anyone would believe her if she said what happened." "She said it," Harper replied. "She finally told someone." Tears formed instantly in Lena's eyes. "She used to draw herself in cages," she whispered, "and I didn't even see it. I thought I was protecting her. But she found her own way out. Through him." That afternoon, a statement was issued to the press, carefully worded, approved by legal counsel. It included verified details of Savannah's situation: her flight from an abusive home, the safety she found with Shaquille O'Neal, and the delay in parental contact due to a domestic situation in progress. For the first time in weeks, the truth emerged with clarity. Darlene Whitmore's story, once gospel to the fearful, unraveled quickly. Screenshots of her exaggerated messages surfaced. Her community watch logs, once thought helpful, now appeared like a pattern of profiling. One by one, her defenders fell silent. At the next town meeting, she arrived early and sat in the back row. Few made eye contact. Even fewer saved her a seat. Meanwhile, Shaq stood on his porch, reading the public statement for the third time. Lucille watched from behind the window, hands clasped. "You didn't have to say anything," she said. "The truth found its way." Shaq nodded. "Took the long way, though." She smiled softly. "Sometimes truth walks slow so it doesn't miss anything." The neighborhood responded in ripples. One by one, neighbors who had withdrawn reappeared. Cards arrived. Some signed, some anonymous. Children returned to the driveway hoop. Teenagers sent video messages of thanks. The candle vigils grew. Not as protests but as tributes. The silence that once screamed suspicion now gave way to something gentler. An understanding, a collective sigh that something dark had passed, and light had entered without apology. Harper published a new piece, "The Girl, the Giant, and the Truth They Tried to Bury." It was thorough, emotional, and unapologetic. She didn't just clear Shaq's name, she exposed the layers, the systemic doubt cast on black men, the fear that silences abuse survivors, and the recklessness of a society addicted to judgment before facts. National networks picked it up. The story trended, not as a scandal, but as a case study in how quickly assumptions turn into injustice. At a press conference, Lena stood beside Harper. Savannah remained home, protected and recovering. "My daughter was not taken," Lena said. "She was rescued by a man none of you deserved to know, but were lucky to. He saw her when no one else did, and you all nearly broke him for it." The room was still. No questions followed. Back at home, Shaq sat at his piano and played for the first time in weeks. The melody wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be. It drifted through the window, down the street, through open blinds and cracked doors, reaching every heart still unsure how to apologize. Because sometimes, music says what words can't. Later that week, Savannah and Lena came to visit. No cameras, no press. Savannah hugged Shaq without hesitation. No words, just a moment of shared understanding between two souls who had survived the storm not by running, but by standing still and letting the truth find them. Lucille served lemonade. Shaq played one more tune, and for the first time in a long while, Maple Street felt like home again. The truth had surfaced. The headlines had shifted. But Maple Street didn't go back to normal. It adjusted. Shaquille O'Neal returned to his quiet routines, not because he craved normalcy, but because rhythm kept him grounded. The mailbox still creaked the same way each morning. The wind still carried Lucille's chimes into the kitchen, where she folded napkins and whispered affirmations beneath her breath. But even with vindication, the air felt different. The news had retracted the story, technically, not with the same force they had used to condemn him, but with carefully worded statements buried beneath larger stories. A scrolling banner here, a buried footnote there. No apology, just a quiet backpedal, as if admitting they were wrong without acknowledging the weight of what that wrong had done. Social media moved on fast. What had once consumed timelines now sank beneath trending hashtags about celebrities, politics, and the next viral drama. The very people who had speculated the loudest vanished with equal speed. But Shaq remembered them. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Darlene Whitmore said nothing. She didn't release a statement. She didn't attend the next HOA meeting. Her porch, once the buzzing hive of whispers and side-eyes, sat still. Neighbors passed her house with a glance, but never stopped. When she did walk outside, she wore sunglasses even on cloudy days. She kept her dog leashed short, never pausing to chat with those she once commanded with charm masked as concern. Some believed silence was punishment enough. Others believed it wasn't punishment at all. Shaq didn't demand anything from her. He never knocked on her door, never confronted her at the market. That wasn't how he operated. His justice wasn't in confrontation. It was in continuation. He returned to his Sunday tradition of community breakfasts. The first few weeks, attendance was low. A handful of loyal neighbors showed up. But word spread. Slowly, families began to trickle back in. Children brought hand-drawn cards. Teenagers helped clean up. Lucille's peach cobbler returned to its place as the centerpiece. But it wasn't the same. There was an unspoken pause in every interaction. An extra second before people made eye contact. A hesitation before they laughed too loud or stood too close. The scar wasn't physical, but it had presence. It stretched across every corner of his day. A reminder not of what happened, but of how quickly people turned. How flimsy trust had become. He didn't dwell on it. But he didn't forget either. One afternoon, while organizing donations for a community shelter, he saw Lena Lee approaching. Her gait was steady, but her eyes flickered with a blend of shame and strength. In her arms, she carried a large cardboard box. "I brought these," she said. "They're books and jackets. Some of Savannah's, some of mine." Shaq took the box silently. They stood in the center of the gymnasium, surrounded by tables lined with canned goods and winter coats. "You don't owe me anything," he said. Lena smiled, soft but unwavering. "That's not why I'm here." She looked around the gym, her gaze taking in the scope of what he did. Not for recognition, but for people. For strangers. "I've been quiet too long," she continued. "And when I wasn't quiet, I was running. But my daughter?" She found a way to speak. "So I will too." She asked to speak at the next community event, a fundraiser Shaq hosted annually for underprivileged students. The night of the event arrived with mild weather and hesitant excitement. People filled the rec center, some dressed up, others in jeans and church shoes. The walls were lined with posters showing local heroes and programs Shaq had funded, little league teams, scholarship recipients, small business launches. At the front of the room, Shaq gave his usual welcome, calm, composed, a voice that carried the weight of endurance. Then he introduced Lena. She stood at the podium, hands steady on either side, and took a breath that pulled the room into silence. "My name is Lena Lee," she began. "Some of you know me. Most of you know my daughter." Her voice didn't tremble. It had the strength of someone who had fallen, gotten up and decided to speak from the ground up. "She was in danger. I was afraid. And the man I thought the world would turn against if she turned to him, ended up being the only one who didn't." She looked directly at Shaq. "She found safety with you, and we nearly destroyed you for it. You didn't just protect my daughter. You gave her dignity. Something she hadn't felt in a long time." The room was hushed. Eyes misted. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. Ashamed. Lena didn't stop there. "I know many of you were silent. Some of you didn't know what to believe. Some chose the easier path, doubt. I did too in other ways. I left her alone thinking distance would solve what fear couldn't." She swallowed hard. But this man didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for pity. He stayed, and he's still here. So now, I'm here too. There was no applause at first. Just the sound of breathing, deep, measured, moved. Then came the claps. Slowly, from the back row forward. Not thunderous but real. Shaq stood still, hands at his sides. His eyes met Lena's and held her gaze. He didn't smile, but he nodded once. Firm. After the event, several attendees approached him. Some apologized quietly, others with trembling voices. One man offered a firm handshake and said, "I should have known better." A woman who hadn't spoken to him in weeks left a note on his windshield. "You never changed. We did. Thank you for staying." But for every olive branch, there were still empty spaces. People who didn't return. Neighbors who nodded but kept their distance. Journalists who refused to print retractions. Those wounds stayed open. Shaq didn't chase closure. He didn't ask the world to feel what he had felt. He simply kept showing up. He walked the streets again. He returned to coaching. He rebuilt his routines, not because the world had welcomed him back, but because he never truly left. Lucille said it best one morning over breakfast. "They didn't break you, baby. They bruised you. And bruises fade. But the ones who watched it happen, they gotta look at themselves a lot longer than they had to look at you." He chuckled, passing her the honey. "You always did know how to land the punch without throwing one." She winked. "That's why they never saw it coming." And so, life on Maple Street moved on. Not unchanged, not healed, but aware. Shaq's porch stayed open. His door remained unlocked during daylight. His heart, though guarded now, never closed. Because redemption doesn't come easy. Not for the accused. Not for the accuser. But in the quiet places, where truth lingers longer than rumor, it comes all the same. Darlene Whitmore had always prided herself on perception. She saw things others missed, or so she believed. Her charm was the subtle kind, layered in manicured smiles and church bake sales, the kind that let her pass as a protector of community standards when, in truth, she was their self-appointed gatekeeper. For years she played the role to perfection. She curated Facebook groups with titles like Brookridge Moms for safety, and moderated neighborhood forums with an iron finger camouflaged in emoji-laced posts. She ran community watch walks, snapping photos of unattended bikes or suspicious characters, and when she reported to police she used words like concerned and uncomfortable, never afraid, because that implied vulnerability. But Darlene's mask didn't just slip. It cracked. It started with Harper Quinn. After Lena Lee's speech, Harper's inbox overflowed with new leads. Among them were anonymous messages, screenshots, voice memos, and digital receipts. Some were from ex-group admins, others from distant relatives, even a former colleague. They all told the same story. Darlene had planted seeds long before Savannah's incident. What happened on Maple Street wasn't an isolated judgment call. It was the latest in a pattern. Harper combed through the data carefully. One thread stood out. A private group chat titled Neighborhood Integrity. In it, Darlene had exchanged dozens of messages, many riddled with racially coded language. That new family on Birch Street? Big group, loud. Reminds me of Detroit. Some of these folks just don't fit our vibe. I'll be watching that O'Neill house. His type draws too much attention. Harper cross-referenced the timestamps with incident reports filed anonymously with Brookridge police. They lined up far too neatly. Then came the emails. Darlene had contacted a local tabloid journalist 2 days before the viral video of Shaq and Savannah hit mainstream news. The subject line read, "Potential story retired celebrity poll young girl. Could be big." She pitched the angle, with practiced vagueness, suggesting community concern, offering to tip them off discreetly if the publication ran it first. The reporter declined the offer, but the email remained in the server, flagged for tone and later shared by a remorseful intern. It was digital kindling, and Harper now held the match. She drafted her exposé methodically, fact-checked every line, consulted legal counsel to ensure clarity and accuracy. She didn't want vengeance. She wanted truth, sharpened and undeniable. When the article dropped, the architect of fear, Darlene Whitmore's quiet campaign, it ignited like dry pine in summer. Public reaction was swift. News outlets that once echoed Darlene's innuendos now turned on her. The very networks that ran with her suspicions aired segments on racial profiling in suburbia. One podcast titled its special episode, "When Karen Has a Neighborhood Watch." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People she once led with charm began distancing themselves overnight. The PTA removed her name from meeting minutes. A local boutique removed her photo from its Community Heroes board. Her employer, a mid-sized real estate firm, quietly updated their website to exclude her bio. 3 days later, she was let go. Misalignment of values, the email read. Darlene tried to stay composed. She wore oversized sunglasses on her morning walks, but her once brisk stride had slowed to something uncertain. She logged out of her neighborhood pages. Her inbox flooded with messages, not of support but of stunned disappointment. "I used to respect you. How could you do that to him? You set our whole street on fire with your whisper." But the loudest silence came from within her home. Her husband, Warren, spoke little now. He hadn't known about the emails, though he'd heard the murmurs over the years. At first, he'd brushed it off as just Darlene being watchful. Now, he couldn't look at her without seeing the cost of that watchfulness. Their daughter, Kylie, home from college, and politically aware, left after the article broke. "You embarrassed us," she said before slamming the door. "You humiliated Dad. You hurt a kid." For Darlene, that was the sharpest cut. Her moral scaffolding, the identity she'd built around righteousness and tradition, had crumbled, and no one was rushing in to rebuild it. Meanwhile, Shaq remained silent. Not in retreat, but in choice. He didn't gloat, didn't repost headlines, didn't celebrate Darlene's fall. Instead, he poured his energy back into the community work he never stopped. He hosted a weekend mental health fair. He sponsored scholarships in Savannah's name. He partnered with Lena for a local shelter drive. His silence echoed louder than Darlene's disgrace. One afternoon, Harper passed Darlene in a quiet parking lot behind the town library. She hadn't planned the meeting. Darlene looked different. No sunglasses, no makeup. Just a woman mid-collapse. Harper paused. Darlene stared back, exhausted. "You got what you wanted," Darlene said, voice hollow. Harper tilted her head. "I didn't want this. I wanted the truth." Darlene opened her mouth, but no defense came. Just a half-swallowed apology she couldn't finish. Harper walked on. In the weeks that followed, Darlene became a cautionary tale, whispered about, pitied by some, mocked by others. But none of them forgot how much damage she'd done. And in poetic symmetry, the same gossip she once wielded became her undoing. The same whispers that condemned Shaq now swirled around her front door. Only this time, there was no hero's resilience waiting beneath the surface. Just a woman left alone with the noise she created. Karma had spoken, not in screams, but in echoes. Winter passed gently in Brookridge that year, its chill softened by the slow burn of healing. The lawns regained their green, porches reopened, and children played again in the streets, without adult tension hovering over their shoulders. But the silence that returned wasn't the same as before. It was quieter, yes, but deeper, wiser, and earned. Shaq O'Neal resumed his life at his own pace. He no longer checked his rearview mirror as often. The mail, once filled with anonymous accusations and media inquiries, now brought thank you notes and school flyers. The porch light stayed on longer in the evenings, and the front gate creaked from new feet finding their way back. He didn't speak much about what had happened, not because he was avoiding it, but because the truth no longer needed repeating. It stood. Lucille, ever the quiet storm behind him, returned to Florida for a time, but called nightly. Her advice never wavered. "Let your peace be your answer," she said. "You already gave them your truth." Savannah Lee, now 12, had blossomed in silence. Therapy gave her a voice, but it was writing that gave her wings. She had discovered journaling as a way to understand what she'd lived through, not just the fear but the confusing hope that followed. And somewhere between the storm and the quiet, she had begun writing a short essay for a national youth competition themed "The Person Who Changed My Life." She called it "The Giant Who Saved Me." In the essay, she didn't describe the rumors or the media frenzy. She didn't mention names or defend anyone. She simply wrote about a man with hands big enough to hold fear, but soft enough to offer a towel. She wrote about the smell of apple juice and the sound of wind chimes. She described safety not as a place but as a person, someone who didn't ask her to speak, just made sure she could. Her words were pure, undeniable, and they spread. The essay won, not just regionally, but nationally. It was published online, then in print. Teachers across the country read it aloud in classrooms. Parents shared it on forums. A major network requested to adapt it for a children's educational segment. Savannah declined politely. She wasn't writing for fame. She was writing because it helped her breathe. Shaq didn't know about the award until a package arrived on his doorstep. It was wrapped in blue tissue paper and tied with a plain ribbon. Inside was a framed print of the essay, hand-signed by Savannah. At the bottom, in small cursive, she had written, "You didn't just save me. You reminded me I could save myself." He stood on the porch for a long time, holding the frame like it was made of glass. Lucille, who had returned for a visit, found him there. "She's brave," he said. Lucille smiled, her eyes glistening. She learned it from someone who never had to raise his voice to be heard. A week later, the Brookridge Community Council quietly organized a recognition ceremony. They didn't call it an award, didn't advertise it with banners. It was a quiet event, held in the same rec center that once housed Whispered Doubts. The guest list was small: Savannah and Lena, Harper Quinn, Principal Parker, a few local volunteers, and a handful of students whose lives Shaq had quietly supported over the years. No cameras, no speeches. They presented him with a handmade plaque, crafted by the same kids he coached in basketball. It read, "To the man who stood when others shook, for reminding us that truth doesn't shout, it stands." Shaq didn't say much in return. He just looked around the room, nodded slowly, and said, "I'm glad y'all came." That was enough. After the event, he sat on a bench outside with Savannah. They watched the sun drop behind the trees, casting long shadows across the parking lot. "You still like cartoons?" he asked. She grinned. "Some." He chuckled. "Me too." They sat in silence, not because they didn't have words, but because they didn't need them. I want to write a book someday, Savannah said suddenly. You should, he said. You got something to say. She looked up at him, her eyes steady. I want to write about the quiet heroes, the ones nobody listens to until it's almost too late. Shaq nodded. That's a story worth telling. In the months that followed, the story of what happened on Maple Street became less about scandal and more about transformation. The town changed, not overnight, and not without resistance, but meaningfully. The neighborhood Facebook group now had new moderators, more balanced, more conscious. School programs implemented workshops on media literacy and community bias. Harper Quinn continued her reporting, now focused on restorative journalism, how stories can heal as much as they expose. Darlene Whitmore moved away quietly, no announcement, no farewell. Her house was sold to a young couple with a newborn and a garden dream. Some pitied her, others didn't, but most understood that some endings write themselves. As for Shaq, he didn't chase a new legacy. He didn't reinvent his image or try to rewrite what had been. He just kept doing what he always had. Showing up. He started a scholarship fund in Savannah's name, not with press releases, but with handwritten letters to applicants. He donated anonymously to women's shelters. Knowing what Lena had endured, he funded a journalism fellowship under Harper's guidance, supporting truth-tellers who choose integrity over virality. And he returned to music. On Sunday mornings before breakfast, he played the piano again. The melodies were slow, sometimes somber, but always full. The kind of music that didn't fill silence. It honored it. Lucille often sat nearby, her knitting needles clicking softly. You ever think about telling your side? She asked once. He smiled. It's already been told. She nodded. Still, people forget. Shaq looked out the window. Children were running across the lawn, chasing a red ball that bounced with impossible joy.
Let him, he said.
Some truths don't need repeating. They just need living. And with that, he pressed another chord. Not loud, not proud, just true. Because in the end, the weight of truth isn't measured in volume. It's measured in what survives. And on Maple Street, it had survived in a little girl's words, a mother's courage, a journalist's integrity, and a giant who never needed to roar to be heard. If this story made you pause, question, or feel good, that's where change begins. Don't scroll past the next whisper, the next silence, the next injustice. Be the one who sees what others ignore. Stand where it's uncomfortable. Because sometimes the real giants aren't the ones who speak loudest. They're the ones who simply refuse to step aside.